But this morning we have a very special speaker. David Barton is the founder of Wall Builders. It's a national pro-family organization that presents America's forgotten heroes and history. Its emphasis is on moral, religious, and constitutional heritage. Wall Builders, of course, comes from the book of Nehemiah and that grassroots effort by Nehemiah to rebuild the walls that had been torn down and to strengthen the honor that had once been there. And so too, Wall Builders is seeking to do the same thing in our country to show forth this grassroots effort of what America could be like and to strengthen the communities, the states, and nations. You know, it's been a blessing to have David Barton as a friend, and I just remember walking through the state capitol on a tour with him years ago, and there were 3 senators that were following us. And we wondered if we were, what they were doing, and they just wanted to listen to David. And they said that everything they had learned about our country was from him. And I love not just his humility, but his love for God, just the gift he is really to our country for such a time as this. I really want to encourage you, if you haven't picked up any of his books, they're out there in the lobby today. And if you could, buy them. Get him out there. Get him to other people. You know, we are using his American Story. My wife's using it for our American history textbook in our class, one of them. And it's so important to know our history. And I was taught, even from Christian textbooks as a kid, that we were a democracy, not a republic, and that most of the founders were deists. And through David, I came to find out that is not true. They did not believe that. Those were lies that were originated in Columbia University along with other things. But when you listen to him, you start to get the truth. So I'm so happy that our county attorneys are listening today, because I'm sure they can take some notes and find out what America is really all about. David has 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and his wife Cheryl's with us as well today. She's amazing, and they live in Aledo, Texas, and it's a privilege to have him here today. And Tim will be here tonight and tomorrow, but without further ado, would you please welcome with me David Barton.
Thank you, guys. It is great to be back with you. Always love being with Pastor Mike and love being with you guys. I want to start this morning with a Bible verse. It comes out of Revelation 1, verses 5 and 6. That verse says very simply, "And Jesus Christ is made us kings and priests unto God and his Father." What does that mean? One of the things you'll find in the Bible is that oftentimes when a scripture is given, the way it's explained is going back to history. 1 Corinthians 10, Paul lays out a thought, and to explain that thought, he goes back to 6 different examples from Jewish history. Say, here's what I'm talking about. Here's the examples. You have also Acts 7, where that Stephen is speaking to the Sanhedrin, and to help understand what he's saying, he goes back through more than 12 historical examples. I want to do that this morning. To find out what it means to be kings and priests, I want to go back to the story of the American founding. The story of the American founding, America began as a colonized nation back in 1607 with Jamestown. That was the first colony. It became a settlement. It became a larger colony. The second one was that of Plymouth. Plymouth was the second group here. And it's interesting, when you look at these 2 colonies, these first two founding areas of America, they're quite different from one another. It goes back to, it's probably best described by the title of an 1859 book done by Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. America literally at its beginning was a tale of 2 cities, quite different from one another, vastly different from one another. And as you look at that, we want to do that this morning. I want to take you through both of those cities real quick, show you what that means in regard to that verse out of Revelation 1. Let's start with Jamestown. Jamestown was founded in 1607 as that group of settlers landed on the coast of Virginia. They got off, they came ashore at what's called Cape Henry. They erected a cross, they knelt down, they had a prayer service, they dedicated the new land of the Lord. There's no question that it was Christian in what they did. If you'll read the Virginia Charter of 1606, it says that they have done all this because it tends to the glory of God's divine majesty and propagating the Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God. That is the Charter of Virginia. That is why they came. That is what authorized them to come. And there's no question when you read that we can say they are evangelical Christians. They came here to evangelize, to share God's word with others. That's why they came. There's also no historical question that they were not very biblical Christians. Can you be an evangelical and not be biblical? Yep. And I'll show you how that works in just a moment. So when you take Jamestown, Jamestown has been the focus for the last 5 years of the 1619 project. 1619 project came out 5 years ago. It is still being used in all 50 states. But their premise was Jamestown is what defines America. Jamestown in 1619, slaves arrived at Jamestown, and this is what defines America is slavery. This is where we talk about critical race theory and other aspects. Slavery is that is the thesis of the Jamestown project. Now, that is the thesis of the 1619 project. Jamestown is everything about America. Point out the 1619 project is not a historical project. They say that they're not. They say that they are about changing the narrative about how Americans view themselves. Their history in that is really, really lousy. 1619, when slaves arrived in Jamestown, slavery was illegal in Jamestown. Those 19 did not stay slaves. They became free. They became landowners. And the first occasion you have of slavery is when one of those original slaves who had been freed, when they got to Jamestown, Anthony Johnson sued to own another black man, John Caser, and the court said, yes, you can do that. And so you have a black man suing to own a black man. That is the first occasion of slavery in Jamestown. That's not in the 1619 project. It doesn't even get close to it, and the year is not even right. It's 1653, not 1619. So that's the first occasion of slavery in Jamestown. Nonetheless, there is no question that Jamestown colony was a pro-slavery colony. That's indisputable. And when you look at Jamestown, that's not the only problem they had. Now, these were all settlers that had come out of Europe. And coming out of Europe, it didn't matter much which country you came from in Europe. What you have, your form of government at that point in time is a monarchy. And so what that is a government controlled by an individual where the government is everything. You don't own private property. You think you do, but the king will take it from you and give it to someone else. You have the job that he tells you he wants you to have. Everything is about the government. And so you don't live in the freedom that we've become experienced to. You live for the sake of the government. You work for the government. You provide to the government. They will give you back what they think you need. Any way you want to describe it, it's what we would call socialism. Socialism is the government owns the capital and means of production, etc. And then they share it with individuals as they want to. So all these folks that came to Jamestown came with a very socialistic mindset. They didn't come with a concept of freedom or of liberty. They were there because the king sent them there. The king wanted this land colonized. They're here for that. And as a result, the king is going to keep them supplied with whatever they need for their colony. The king will send them ships with food. But you see, the problem is at that point in time, England had colonies all over the world. It was said that the sun never sets on the English empire because there's always a colony somewhere where the sun is still up because they had land all around the world. Jamestown, a couple hundred settlers, that's not a real big thing on the king's list. And so he didn't always remember to send them food at the appropriate time. Now, they're over here waiting for food, waiting for the king to tell them what to do, and they set up a colony in the meantime, try to govern it the way the king would want them to, and the king would allow them to. But they're not hard workers. They come out of a colony in Europe, or a concept in Europe where that you have various classes. You have the aristocracy and the lords and the nobles, and you have the businessmen, and then you have the yeomen, and then you have the workers, and then you have the slaves. There are classes. There are very clear distinctions there. And so a lot of those that came to Jamestown were from the nobility side, the aristocracy side, and they don't work for themselves. They'll have other people work for them, and they'll rely on the king to send them whatever they need. Well, the king wasn't real faithful in sending what they needed because this is not a big part of his thinking. He's got so much other to worry about. And so as you look in the first couple of years, these people did not work much. They did not harvest much. They did not plant much. They waited on the king to supply them. And so in the first 2 years, they got a lot of their supplies literally from Indians. The Indians were great when they got there. They had a good relationship to start with. The Indians wanted to be good neighbors. The Indians would supply them with corn, supply them with food, supply them what they needed. But they still, these settlers didn't work well at all. And so one of their early governors, John Smith, he said very simply, guys, here's the policy. If you don't work, you don't eat. And he just quoted out of 2 Thessalonians 3:10. You're not going to get a free ride here. You're going to have to do something. If you don't work, you don't eat. Now, that was not good news for a whole lot of them, so they just attempted to blow him up, and he got burned with gunpowder, and he had to go back to England to get treatment, and so he's gone, so now we're in good shape again. We don't have to work because this governor is going to make us work, and we're not going to do that. And so as they come to their third winter, what happens in that third winter? The Indians say, look, we're having a tough time just supplying our own needs. So we're just not going to be able to keep giving you everything you want. We can't keep supplying all of your needs too. You guys are going to have to come up with your own means of gathering food. So this is where they enter into their third winter. And that third winter is often called the starving time. That's the winter of 1609, 1610. In that winter, as they go into that winter, they went into that winter with a total of 490 colonists that they had in Jamestown. They came out of that winter with only 60 colonists in Jamestown. 430 starved to death that winter. Now, as you go in, the king hadn't supplied you what you need, and you're not working to get what you need largely. And so, I'm sure some people were working, but not enough to produce what the colony needed. And so as they rely on government to supply their needs, and it doesn't happen, they start looking for ways to stay alive, and they're hungry and they don't have anything set aside, and so you start eating the rats and the frogs and the snakes and the mice, whatever you can get your hands on, and that'll go for a while. Well, now we got to move up to the pets, the dogs and the cats and anything else, and that works for a while. And then you start eating your livestock, which is supposed to help produce a harvest for you. You eat your horses and you eat your cows, and they're still not through the winter, and they've still got a long way to go. And it dawns on some of them, man, we're burying a lot of people from starving to death, but there's still some meat on their bones. So they literally go to the cemetery, dig up the corpses to get the meat off the corpses, to eat what they can off the corpses. It got so bad that one man, he killed his pregnant wife, he cut her open, he ate the unborn child, and then ate his wife. As you can imagine, he was executed for that. And then they ate him after they executed him. So any way you want to go at Jamestown, they've got a lot of problems. They got a lot more problems than the 1619 Project talks about, but they've got a lot of problems in Jamestown. And after they come out of that winter, they then start Indian wars. So we're going to make the Indians supply us with food. They even kidnap Pocahontas to hold her hostage because we got the daughter of the prince, we got the daughter of the king, we got the princess here, and we'll hold her and make them bring us food for Pocahontas. We'll keep her alive. And so there's no question about Jamestown that there's just not a great model. There were some good people there. They had some good leaders. Reverend Alexander Whitaker was a good guy, and Reverend Hunt, and they had some good leaders. But by and large, the colony as a whole, professing evangelical Christians, and just not a good model in a lot of ways. They were elitist, they were socialistic, they were pro-slavery, they were big government, they were group conscious, and that's just kind of the way Jamestown was. And so 1619 Project, they focus on part of that. Again, there's a lot more worse than the 1619 Project says, but the 1619 Project is not trying to be history. It's trying to create a narrative that it's all about race and slavery in America. So there's another side. There's the second colony that came to America, the 1620. We could call it the 1620 Project, but this is the other part of the Tale of Two Cities. This is the one that rarely gets studied anywhere in America today. It does in some Christian schools, but even they don't study it like they should. And this is the one that really is the model of what produced America. This is where we get so many of the habits that we still have today, and I'll show you that as we go through. So when you look at the Pilgrims, it's interesting. Now, this picture actually hangs in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. And the rotunda of the Capitol is 14 feet high. It is 20 feet wide. It literally is a life-size painting of these guys. There are 8 paintings that hang in the rotunda of the Capitol, all this size. 4 of them deal with the American Revolution, independence, and 4 of them deal with colonization, exploration. And in those 4 paintings, you'll find 2 Bible studies, a prayer meeting, and an evangelism going on. So they're very religious, and that's what you see when you walk in the Capitol's paintings like this. What's interesting about the Pilgrims is the Pilgrims, nearly any time you find a picture or painting or depiction of the Pilgrims from back in the day, nearly always it shows them gathered around a Bible. This was the center of their life. Now, I will point out that Bible, you see, we have 2 large museums in Texas. If you ever get there, we invite you to both museums. We have everything from stuff from Columbus all the way through the landing on the moon. Just terrific stuff, tens of thousands of documents, artifacts, etc., including Bibles like they hold right there. That is called a Geneva Bible. Now, that Geneva Bible, first printed in Geneva, Switzerland in 1560, it is the first Bible in the English language done in the world. That's what the Pilgrims brought with them, and that Bible, by the way, is called the world's first pocket Bible. I'm not sure how big your pockets are, but mine aren't quite that big. But they called it that because all Bibles previous to this, for 1,000 years previous, were called pulpit Bibles. They were about 4 times as large as that Bible, and they were chained to the pulpit of churches. You see, at that point in time, the government was in charge of everything, including your religion. And it really doesn't matter what God's Word says. We'll tell you what you need to know out of there. And so this is where illiteracy became very high. Once you get to 390 AD, that's where you have your first state-established church. The government walks in and says, here's what you're going to do for religion, here's how you're going to practice it, and here's what you're going to do with your faith. And at that point in time, why do you need a Bible? Because the government tells you what you will do, and if you don't do it, you're going to be punished. So that's where you find that Bibles pretty much went away. They were chained to the pulpit of churches. This is the first Bible that comes back that an individual can own and carry around himself. This is part of what was called the Reformation. Tyndale and Wycliffe and so many others, they're all about getting every person a Bible so they can read the Bible and see all the things I'm about to show you. Too many people today think the Bible is a great spiritual book, but it's a great book for economics, it's a great book for criminal justice, it's a great book for education, it's a great book for anything in life, which you're about to see. So the Pilgrims, they have this, and as you look at the Pilgrims, the group of the Pilgrims, their pastor was John Robinson. Understand the Pilgrims were not a colony per se. The Pilgrims were a congregation. They had been in England, and reading that book, they're saying, man, the king has got this all wrong. And so their original pastor, John Greenwood, made the mistake of saying in England, Queen Elizabeth, you have Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, his daughter. Queen Elizabeth is now the queen over England, and the pastor, Pastor Greenwood, said, Jesus Christ is head of the Christian church. For saying that, she executed him, said, no, I'm the head of the Christian church. And then they passed a law in England that says anyone who denies Her Majesty's ecclesiastical supremacy, anybody who says she's not the head of the Christian church will be summarily thrown in prison and dealt with. So this is where the Pilgrims said, this is probably not a good country for us to stay in because we don't think she's the head of the church. We think Jesus is the head of the church. So they went to Holland. They lived in Holland for about 12 years. But still there, as they read the Bible, they're still criticizing the king and the government. And they come up in 1619 with what's called the Perth Assembly. They list about 7 different things of doctrine that they think the Church of England got wrong. And so the king is really ticked at them and sends forces from England to Holland to chase these people out. And so they're on their way to the New World to get away. And at that point in time, they are a congregation coming. They're coming on 2 ships, but one of the ships develops problems, a speedwell. And so the Mayflower is the only one that makes it. So Pastor Robinson did not make it with this congregation to America. Half of his congregation came, but he told them before he left, he says, look, when you get over to that new world, do not take with you the darkness of the old world. You have an opportunity to do something brand new over there, and don't take this stuff with you. Do it right when you get there. And so when they land in the new world, before they get off the ship, they write what's called the Mayflower Compact. This is the compact that they are making to do things a different way, a new way. And on the ship, they sign it. This is the first civil document created in America. And if you look at the Mayflower Compact, it too is very Christian in its rhetoric. It says, having undertaken for the glory of God the advancement of the Christian faith, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. And by the way, you see the Christian part there, but the northern parts of Virginia, I thought this was Massachusetts. Well, what you got to understand is back then when the king had sent explorers over to America, he then claimed it all. My guys have been there and it all belongs to me. And so if you look at the early maps of what we call America, you'll see from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from north to south, it's all called Virginia. It's all his. It's all the king's. It's all Virginia. They've landed in the northern parts of Virginia, which we now call Massachusetts, but it's all Virginia back then. So you see again that this is very Christian in the rhetoric. These guys said, okay, pastor said don't do what we've been doing in Europe unless it's part of what the Bible says. And so we need to think about government. What are we going to do for a government here? Because when you look in the Bible illustrates 7 different forms of government. And what government are we going to choose when we get to America? And they chose the government that you find illustrated in Exodus 18:21. Exodus 18:21, this is where the Hebrew Republic is being founded. They have come out from under Pharaoh. God has led them across the Red Sea. They're now creating the Hebrew Republic. God gives them 613 laws. The 613 laws cover every conceivable aspect of life, criminal justice, economics, consanguinity, whatever it is. It covers it all, and it covers their form of government. As Moses is putting it together, his father-in-law Jethro comes to him and says, here's how you need to do government. And it says, choose out from among you leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. Okay, from among you, pick your own leaders over tens, 50s, hundreds. That's like local, county, state, and federal. Choose your own leaders. And then the scripture says, choose able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, men who will rule in the fear of God. So there's your qualifications for office. It says, hey, let's do that. Let's have an elective government. And that's what they did. They created an elected government that's not going on anywhere in Europe at that point in time. But they said, here in America, we're going to create an elected government where we elect our officials at every level. And so that's what they set up. Now, significantly, as they did that, the Bible doesn't tell you how often to have elections. So what are we going to do? Well, they said, why don't we do it every year? So they set up annual elections, and they started having elections every year. And one of their early governors, William Bradford, he served 30 terms as governor. That sounds like a long time. Yeah, but each term was 1 year. So it's like serving 7 or 8 terms a day, which would still be a long time. But every year they had an election for their civil leaders, and if the leader doesn't do right, we'll get them out of there and get somebody else in there that will do right. And the other thing that goes with what they did is they separated the institutions. If you go back into the scriptures, when God created the Hebrew Republic, what he did was he gave them 613 laws, and he talked about the temple, and he talked about the government. And he says, okay, here's the way it's going to work. Moses, you're over all the civil stuff, and Aaron, you're over all the temple stuff. Now, neither one of those two institutions was secular. God had both of them. He gave clear instructions for both, but he had separate leaders over each one. You didn't have one leader that ran both church and state. This changed in 390 AD when Emperor Theodosius, who was the emperor of the world, the Roman emperor, had the whole world at that time, he became a Christian. And he joyfully announced to the world, he says, I'm now a Christian. And then he said, and you're all going to become Christians or I'm going to kill you. And that's the first state-established church, is Emperor Theodosius in 390 AD. That was the practice for the next 1,000 years, but that was not God's practice. God said, no, I don't put one guy over all the institutions. I've got different leaders over different institutions, separation of powers type stuff. And so you'll find that later in the Bible, in 2 Chronicles 26, King Uzziah, who was a king blessed by God, God blessed his animal husbandry, blessed his economics, blessed his military. He's one of the greatest military leaders in the world at that time. Israel had peace under him for, I think he ruled 52 years. He made catapults so strong that they would reach the enemy before the enemy ever got in range to hit his guys. So he's just pounding the enemy and wiping them out before they can even start an attack. He's just a great king. And he's a godly man. And he decides, I'm going in the temple and offering thanksgiving to God. I'm offering sacrifices of thanksgiving to God. He went in the temple. The priest met him at the door and said, no. We're the priest. We do sacrifices. That's not what you do. He said, I'm the king. Don't ever tell me what I can and can't do. He went in and offered the sacrifices, and God struck him down at the altar. He went out. He had leprosy. He died shortly thereafter. God made it really clear, look, I set it up. I have different leaders over church and state. So that's what the Pilgrims did. The Pilgrims not only had annual elections, they had annual elections not only of their governor, but also of their pastor. So every year they had an election for who's their pastor this year. Every year they had an election for who's our governor this year. That's the first time that you see us separated institutions in nearly 1,000 years. And it was the Pilgrims who did that. And because they ended the state-established church, that's where you get the rights of conscience, and that's where you get religious toleration, so many other. One thing that they started, in addition to that, they also came to America as a congregation. Therefore, they lived pretty much by Acts 2:41, 42. They had everything in common. They shared with one another, their congregation. They take care of each other's needs. But that's not necessarily the biblical way of doing things. And they looked at the free enterprise system, and it's really the Pilgrims that created the first free market system as we know it today. The Pilgrims, they got there, and their governor, William Bradford, said, we had a lot of lazy people as well, because they figured out that whether they work or not, whatever we make, we're going to share with everybody in common. And he said we had a lot of people among us that didn't work and didn't work hard. And so what they do is they quote that verse that John Smith quoted in Virginia, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, if you don't work, you don't eat. But they went further. Bible says in 1 Timothy 5:8 that if you don't provide for your own household, you're worse than an infidel. You've denied the faith. They said, we're not providing for our own household, we're providing for everybody else's household. So they did what the book of Psalms talks about, where that God took and he set them all individually over property, and they took the widows and orphans, assigned them the families, and they said, look, here's your property, this is what you've bought, what you own, you make it produce for your family, and if you don't, you're going to be hungry. We'll take care of widows and orphans, but you got to make it produce. And so this is where you get the free enterprise system started. The first free enterprise business was in 1627, Pawtucket, Massachusetts. Really the first enterprise business in nearly 1,000 years, because it wasn't going in Europe. And so they get it started over here, and Governor Bradford said that within only 2 years after they moved to the free market system, they moved from Christian socialism to free market system, within only 2 years their productivity increased sevenfold. Now, they used several. They never again had a time of want in the Plymouth colony after they moved to that free market system. And there were other verses. You're aware that in the Bible, Jesus has many economic parables. But if you look at Matthew 25 and Luke 19 and Matthew 20, all this stuff created that free market system. And so that's the kind of teachings they rely on to do that. So free market system we point to with the Pilgrims. In the same way, private property. See, these guys came to America and they're going to live here. But when they arrived, they did not see a single Indian at all when they arrived, but they are conscious of private property. 10 Commandments very clear on private property. Don't take somebody else's private property. Don't even want somebody else's private property. The kings didn't think that way. All the property was theirs, and we'll let you use what we want you to, but these guys were thinking different. This is private property. We're coming to a land. We don't know who owns that land, and we need to build houses there, but we can't find anybody to ask them about. What do we do? So they came ashore in December, which is a lousy time to arrive in Massachusetts, is December. They came ashore in December and they started building homes. They found an uninhabited area where they found no one there. It appeared to be completely abandoned, completely open, so they started building houses. But they still got this concern about whose land is this, what property. And lo and behold, when spring came, they saw their first Native American. Samoset came walking in the camp, and it's like, where did this come from? Who are you guys? And he spoke English, which... think that one out. How do you get to America and you have an Indian that's speaking English? Now, he didn't speak it very well, and so they had their questions for him. He said, hold on, I know somebody who speaks it a lot better than I do. So that's where they get introduced to Squanto. Samoset brings Squanto back. Squanto had been captured as a slave and sold in Spanish markets as a slave. Some Catholic priests in Spain saw these Indians being sold and said, this is not right, and they went and purchased all the Indians and set them all free. And at that point in time, Squanto was one of those that was kidnapped and sold as a slave. But he went over to England, and he lived in England for several years. He learned to speak the English language. He learned how Englishmen thought. And he gets there and he looks at these guys, and they don't have a clue how to live in the New World. Now, they can do pretty good in London or Holland, but they can't do good in the New World. And so he kind of adopts them as his project. This is why God saved him alive, is so he could help these folks. And so he introduces them to the chief. Massasoit is the chief of all the tribes there and the confederation of all the various tribes. And they work out this deal where they're able to purchase private property. And Chief Massasoit, nobody lives here. This is where the Pawtucket tribe used to live, but they were all wiped out by plague. So this is a completely abandoned area, and we'll sell you this area. So they worked out an agreement to purchase land from the Indians. And it's striking that when you look at what they did with private property and how they purchased the land, even 2 generations later, the governor, Josiah Winslow, said very simply, here's the governor of Massachusetts. He says, I think I can clearly say that the English did not possess 1 foot of land in this colony, but what was fairly obtained by honest purchase of the Indian proprietors. We don't have a square foot of land, but what we have a title deed for it. And the agreement was such that both the Indians and the colonists were happy with the deal. That's why they made the transaction. They both said, this is a good deal for both of us. So it's mutually beneficial. And that's why the longest lasting treaty in American history between Anglos and Native Americans is with the Pilgrims. It lasted 56 years, and when it was broken in 1876, or in 1676, it was actually the Wampanoag Indians who broke the treaty, not the Anglos who broke the treaty. So longest lasting treaty in American history because they respected private property. They wouldn't take it. In addition to what they did with private property, you can move into what we would consider civil rights. Whereas the 1619 Project wants to make America look unique because we started slavery in the world, There's not hardly a nation in the world we can find anywhere that didn't have slavery at that time. That was a global practice. Everybody had it. Everybody did it. It was a common practice. Jamestown did it. It wasn't the practice of the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, in 1641, they passed an anti-slavery law, quite unique in the history of the world at that time, quite different. And they did so by quoting directly out of the scriptures. If you look at the laws, they passed laws year by year. And if you look, the anti-slavery law quoted directly Exodus 21:16. This is part of what's called the Code of 1650. And you can see up there, it's unusual spellings for what we're used to today. But here in the middle, it says, if any man stealeth a man or mankind, he should be put to death. Exodus 21:16. Slavery was called man stealing. Slavery is when you go to a country, you steal someone out of the country, take them to a different place, and you sell them into slavery. They said, that's a capital offense in our colony. We're not going to allow this. And by the way, you see above it, if any man shall forcibly and without consent ravish any maid or woman that is lawfully married or contracted, he should be put to death, Deuteronomy 22. If any man rise up by false witness, willingly and of purpose take it away at any man's life, he should be put to death, Deuteronomy. They just quoted, the scriptures give the morals on what's right and wrong. This is where many of the early legal codes came from, was out of the scriptures, and this is what the Pilgrims did. That's why they abolished slavery. It was 5 years later that a slave ship arrived in Jamestown. The captain and officers get off and say, hey, we got slaves. Who needs slaves? We got lots of slaves, lots of selections. And that's what they would do in any port they went to. They arrive in the Plymouth port, and the Pilgrims say, you got what? You have slaves? They arrested the captain. They arrested the officers. They sentenced them to death. The captain says, whoa, 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 whoa. You guys don't do slavery here? We've not been to a place that does. Everybody does slavery. We didn't know you didn't do slavery. And they said, point taken. You didn't know, but now you do. We're going to let you go, but if you ever return here with any slaves again, you now know, and we will execute you next time you return. So they left, but they left the slaves behind. The Pilgrims didn't let them take the slaves with them. The Pilgrims then took all of the slaves and they raised money from among themselves. They hired a ship and they hired a captain and said, we'll take you guys back wherever you came from, wherever you want to go. We'll get you back so you won't be in slavery. So at their own expense, they sent all of those kidnapped people, all the man stealing, they sent them back to where they wanted to go. That was out of their own pocket, out of their own expense. They made it right, even though they weren't the ones that made it wrong. So you'll find from the very beginning that the Plymouth colony says, no, we don't do slavery here. There's actually an editorial cartoon done in a Boston newspaper in 1792, and it's called the Equality Ball. What you see on the left is Governor John Hancock, signer of the Declaration, founding father. He's shaking hands with a black man. That black man is named Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey is the wealthiest black man in America. He and his sons own a global shipping business. They do shipping all over the known world at that time. And they're celebrating the fact that in Massachusetts, blacks and whites have always been equal. As a matter of fact, after that, some generations later, Robert Brown Elliott, who's an early black U.S. congressman, he pointed out there never was a time in Massachusetts history when blacks and whites weren't equal. From the very beginning, it was that way. That's not what we get today. We get critical race theory in the 1619 Project, and that did happen in America. And listen, when you do history, you have to teach the good, the bad, and the ugly. But what we do is we teach the bad and ugly and leave all the good out. We try to make everything look like it's the worst ever, and America's got to be absolutely fundamentally remade because we've got all these bad flaws. Well, if that's all you teach and you don't teach the other side, maybe that's why people want so much change. But let's continue. So if you look at these guys, we're told today it's all a bunch of white guys who founded America. This is the racism, critical race theory. And you know what? They are a bunch of white guys in that picture. And they did do the Declaration of Independence. And how do we know what they looked like? Because back then there's no cameras. And back then to get a picture painted cost a lot of money. So they would only paint pictures if you could pay for it or if you had done something really significant. If you're a governor, if you're a great military general, if you're the president of a university, if you sign the Declaration, the paintings of you because you're really famous. It's interesting how many paintings we have from back in that day that are also black individuals. Now, most people today cannot name these individuals, but why do we know what they look like? Because they were so famous in the day that we did pictures of them back then. They did so much significant stuff. And one of the guys, I can go through there. The guy on the bottom right, Jack Sisson, going across the bottom is John Chavez, and then Lemuel Hayden and Absalom Jones. But the guy on the far left there, the guy riding the horse, Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell, patriot, he did a Paul Revere-like ride in New Hampshire. He's out of New Hampshire, one of the strong leaders in New Hampshire. It's interesting, he was elected to office, and he was elected in 1768. White community elected a black man to office in 1768. He was reelected for the next 49 years. He held 8 different political positions in New Hampshire. So here's a black man elected in a white community to all these positions. He's considered the founder of the public schools in New Hampshire. He's considered the founder of the libraries there. And he is a great patriot. And he's elected to office in 1768. But that's not first by a long shot. You have to go back to 1641. Matthias D'Souza, a black man in a white community, is elected to the state legislature of Maryland in 1641. As a matter of fact, if you look at America and you consider the fact that we were electing black officials in 1641, by the time you get to 1876 in America, we've elected more than 1,000 black officials to office in America by 1876. So may I put a context on that? If you take Great Britain, when did Great Britain elect their first black official to office? 1987. When did Italy elect their first black official to office? 2010. And for us, we did it in 1641, and we're the bad nation. We're the bad guys. More than 1,000 black elected officials by 1876. See, we're just historical illiterate. We don't have a clue who we are as a people. And as a result, this is why we get led in directions we shouldn't be going. So coming back to the Pilgrims, they're the ones who did so much on civil rights. You also see what they did in education, because they brought their kids with them when they came. But they want their kids educated. Now, what do they want them educated in? For them, the Bible is the guidebook of life. This is where they find their economic system. This is where they find so much else. And they want everyone to know the Bible. And so what they do, the first public school law passed in America is included in the Code of 1650. That law is, the title of that law is called the Old Deluder Satan Act. Now, this is your first public education law in America. And here it is. Down at the bottom, it says, it being the one chief project that old deluder Satan, to keep men from knowledge of the scriptures that he has in former days. Satan's goal is always to keep us from knowing the scriptures, because if you know that, then you won't have the liberty, you won't have the freedom, you won't have the enterprise, you won't have all the other stuff. We're going to make sure everybody knows the scriptures. So when they did it in New England, they also not only taught the kids, they taught boys and girls. That wasn't being done in Europe. Do you know in that backwater colony of Massachusetts, the highest literacy level in the world at that time for women was over in Massachusetts? It wasn't in Spain, it wasn't in France, it wasn't in England, it wasn't in any of those enlightened nations. It was in this backwoods colony over here. And the highest literacy rate for women is in Massachusetts? Yep, because we thought everybody needs an education, because everybody needs to know what God's word says. Now, if you'll follow that on education over the next couple centuries, you can choose any state you want. I mean, I'm from Texas, so like you guys, we were a Mexican territory. We become a republic. We become a state. And we've got records just like every state does. Every state keeps records on education, tell you in any given year how many schools there were, how many teachers there were, how many students were attending school. And I went through and just looked at old records. We have so many of these things. I just looked at New Jersey schools, just picked them by random. And in New Jersey schools, it's interesting to see what the New Jersey schools were doing in 1816. Now, this is roughly 2 centuries after the Pilgrims. This is still in that northern part of the United States where the Pilgrims had effect. It's not down in the southern part where the Jamestown colony was, in that northern part. And it's interesting that if you look at the annual report for the public schools of New Jersey in 1816, this is what they put out as the annual report. They're talking about the first and second grades. They call them the first and second classes. It says, all the scholars of the first and second classes commit to memory portions of the New Testament or Psalms, a lesson of the Catechism, several hymns, and the text of the preceding Sabbath. So every kid in first and second grade memorized that. Now, by the way, what is the text of the preceding Sabbath? It's simple. Whatever Pastor Mike talked about last week, you memorize all the verses he mentioned in the sermon. By the way, that's probably not a bad idea to do. Figure out whatever verses he mentioned in the sermon, and through the week, try to memorize every verse that he talked about. That's what public schools were doing in New Jersey in 1816. Now, it doesn't stop there, because we all know there are some kids who are a lot smarter than other kids. And they talked about one of those kids. They said one of the scholars has committed to memory the book of John and the first 30 Psalms together with the 119th Psalm. Time out. We're talking first and second grade, and that kid memorized the Gospel of John and 30 Psalms and Psalms 119 as a first and second grader? Yeah, but that's a smart kid. The other kids weren't like that. It says the majority have committed to memory the Gospel by John. Every first, second grader memorized the Gospel of John, but we had one kid that also memorized 30 more chapters in Psalm and Psalm 1, but everybody memorized the Gospel. How many people do you know that memorized the Gospel of John? That's public schools in New Jersey in 1816. By the way, I looked in Pennsylvania, and in 1892, public schools in Pennsylvania, students were required to memorize a chapter of the Bible a week or a long passage of the Bible. So every week you're memorizing a chapter or a lengthy passage like what we had in Bible reading this morning, the 12 verses. Yeah, that's what public schools were doing in 1892 in Pennsylvania. So you see where we are today, how secular it's become. That's not the way it was. That happened in 1962, 63 in three cases. Abbott and Shemp, Engel, Vital, and Engel Vital, Abbott versus Curlett, and then there was a third one. But anyway, three cases, 62, 63 is when the court said, no, we're not doing this in public schools anymore. What we've got now is something new. It's not the way it was. So going back to education, the final thing I'll point to is due process. And this is the area, due process rights. And due process rights in the Constitution today, the 4th or the 8th Amendment has due process rights. It's the right to confront your accuser, the right to compel witnesses on your behalf, the right to testify in your own defense. All that's called the due process rights. That's the 4th or the 8th Amendment. If you go back, this is where we can fault the Massachusetts people and say they didn't get this one really exactly right. And every textbook I've ever seen, I do a lot of textbook work all across the United States for all sorts of publishers. It's interesting that every publisher talks about the failures of these guys. They're intolerant because they came here seeking this freedom, and then they have the witch trials to kill people who disagree with them. So that's not very tolerant, is it? It's interesting to see what happened. There's a couple of questions that should be asked with this. Okay, they're involved in witch trials. There's no question about that. How many people were put to death in the Massachusetts witch trials? Answer is 27. How long did the Massachusetts witch trials run? Answer is 18 months. The bigger question should be, why did those trials come to a stop? Because you see, the entire world was having witch trials at the time. It was like slavery. Every nation was having witch trials. Witch trials went in Europe more than a century. So 18 months in America, but why did they come to an end? They came to an end when three Christian leaders, Pastor John Wise, Pastor Increase Mather, and Thomas Brattle, they went to Governor Phipps and said, Phipps, what you're doing is not right. Here's what the scripture says. You're just copying Europe. You're doing what every other government across the world is doing. That's not the right thing to do. And they showed Phipps out of the scriptures, and Phipps says, you know, you're right. He called in Judge Samuel Sewell, who's in charge of the trials. He said, Sewell, look at this. We're doing wrong. They stopped the trials. It's interesting. They did their best to try to fix things afterwards. The governor issued a call for a colony-wide day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, seeking to avert God's judgment for having shed innocent blood, which they had done by executing the way they did. Then they also said, you know, these people have been wrongly convicted, and we don't want them having a bad reputation. So they went back through the legal books and pulled all their names out of the legal books so it wouldn't be part of the historical record, because they were wrongly convicted of something they shouldn't have been convicted of because the evidence wasn't right, the process wasn't right. And then on top of that, they went to each of those families and paid restitution, trying to make right what they had done. They removed bread earners sometimes, removed mothers or whatever. And so they tried. Now, I've never seen an American textbook cover to what they tried to do to fix it when it ended or why it ended. They had the trials. So let's talk about the rest of the world. When you look at the rest of the world and the trials, whoops, lost it. Come back in a minute. Guys, should I close out of here and open mine again? Okay. We'll see what's happening. So the issue is that with the European nations, do you know how many people were put to death in the European witch trials? 500,000. How come textbooks talk about the 27 in America and never mention the 500,000? It's not that we were perfect in America. We made many mistakes, but we got out of our mistakes faster than the rest of the world did. 27 versus 500,000, that's a big deal, and that's not what we talk about. So intolerant Christians, yeah, maybe, but they're also the ones who tried to fix the things and get this thing right. And so when you look at due process, I've been involved in 13 cases, U.S. Supreme Court, and probably the most secular justice I know in court history is Stephen Breyer. He recently retired from the court, but Stephen Breyer was reading one of his decisions, and he said, well, of course, we all know that the due process rights came out of the Bible. Really? We all know that? Where'd you get that? And so I looked at his footnote. It went to Federal Practice and Procedure, volume number 30. If you practice federal law, there's a series of law books that goes from here out the door, out in the parking lot, federal law books, and volume 30 deals with these due process rights. And 20 pages in volume 30 show you that our due process rights we have in the Bill of Rights came out of the Bible. The right to confront your accuser was John 8:10. The right to compel witnesses on your behalf is Proverbs 18:17. The right to speak in your own defense is Acts 22:1. All these Bible verses, and even Justice Breyer acknowledges due process rights, they came out of the Bible. This is where we got them. That's not what we hear today. That's not, we don't think the Bible applies to every aspect of life. It does. So when you see all this, I mentioned earlier that if you look at the Pilgrims, virtually every picture you see of the Pilgrims, you will find them with a Bible. Look at that. Every one of them has a Bible. They all studied, they were called the people of the book. So these guys, like Jamestown, they were professing Christians, but unlike Jamestown, they were biblically practicing Christians. They actually lived by the stuff. They didn't just have the title of Christian. They actually read the book and lived by the book, and that's a big deal. So when you compare 1619 and 1620, you go back to that verse I started with, Revelation 1, 5, and 6, and Jesus Christ has made us kings and priests unto God and his Father. The Pilgrims, when you look at the Pilgrims, they were capable of being both kings and priests. Every year they had an election. This year you can be the governor, and this year you'll be, no, any of them could be governor, could be pastor. They were fully equipped to be able to do that because they spent time in the Word. Because they knew the Word and they knew how to apply to every aspect of life, literally they could be kings and priests, and that's why they had elections every year. When you go to the Jamestown colony, they weren't capable of being kings or priests. They literally had to send the people in to do the right thing. They couldn't govern themselves. They couldn't be spiritual leaders over themselves. So this is what I challenge you with. Every one of us as Christians today, every one of you should be capable of leading a Bible study, and every one of you should be capable of running a precinct meeting in politics. Only reason we can't is because we don't apply God's word in the same way. So I challenge you to be kings and priests. Get into that arena. Do all you can to make differences in that arena. Equip yourself politically. Equip yourself governmentally. Equip yourself spiritually and biblically. That's what makes the difference. We need to be kings and priests. If this information is new to you, we got tables outside with lots of information. Worship team.